Patty, do you mind projecting? It doesn't work from my screen for some reason, even when I hit share screen.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to all that are joining us this evening at 5:15 for our work session. This evening's topic will be our middle school continuous improvement plans. At this point, we have reviewed the elementary and high school. So certainly, last but not least, are our middle schools. So welcome to all of you. Really happy to have you with us. And with that, I will hand it over to Director Fields to kick us off. So thank you, Member.
Thank you, everybody, and good evening. We are excited to be here tonight, and we're going to continue the sort of format as high school, but actually allow more time for the roundtable conversation that we were a little bit more limited to prior. So I will go ahead and jump in. And I think everyone has the presentation in front of them, so I will just start chatting, and if it comes up, then awesome. But again, good evening to everyone, and we're here to talk about the middle school continuous improvement plan and have a roundtable discussion. Our principals are prepared and ready for any and all clarifying and probing questions, so hope you truly got a chance to review the documents in advance and look forward to that conversation. Some things you'll hear tonight is some aligned high leverage themes that cross collaboration and partnership around safe and welcoming environments and around authentic, meaningful, and relevant student engagement. So before we jump into the open questions and roundtable, we're going to hear from each of our awesome principals to give just sort of a SIP overview, 2 to 3 minutes specific to their school. And we are going to kick off with Principal Andy Van Fleet from Fowler Middle School.
If I can figure out how to unmute here. All right, well, thanks for inviting us in to share a little bit more. First and foremost, kind of on the spirit of collaboration that we've already been talking about. Without a doubt, the work we did over the summer, the work that we've been doing administratively through the first quarter, and now we're moving through quarter 2, as well as the collaboration between our buildings and our teaching staff has been incredibly phenomenal. Like I've worked in some very collaborative spaces, but I don't think I've ever been in a position that I'm in this year where the level of collaboration has been as strong. So it was very easy for the 3 building principals to work together to come up with some common themes, common foci. And it just happens to be that, yes, indeed, these are some super, super important things for our students in this distance learning environment. One of those major elements that we've been taking a look at, and we've heard it from community, we've seen it firsthand in this environment, is that need to be regulated, that social emotional learning piece in this distance environment where we can't necessarily get that physical need met of the high five, the handshake, that bumping in the halls that middle school students are accustomed to. It's who they are. So within the improvement plans we put together, we really took a look at that social emotional learning piece. The morning meeting structure that we have, where we have gone through intensive training for our faculty to make sure that our teachers understand and feel comfortable leading students through a collaborative family style process where everybody has a chance to speak. Everybody has a chance to hear that somebody cares about them and that their voice is heard. And we're in the process and just wrapped up a first round of student surveys to see if our intent is actually occurring in classes. We'll continue to monitor this throughout the year, but do students feel like their voices are heard and they're valued in the classroom? So that structure is not only just in the morning meetings that we're working on, but it's taking life and wings into other core classes as well, because that structure of a class in validating students and encouraging participation, it's just good instruction in general. So huge piece there. Along with that SEL focus and helping students feel regulated is the engagement piece. Now, within that, I already spoke a little bit about the morning meeting and the circle structure. That in itself is a great engagement strategy and tool because everyone does get an opportunity to share. But we're also looking at and continuing to explore how do we ratchet up our engagement, whether that's using Pear Deck, which is a relatively new tool for our faculty. The ideas around the Kahoot interactive elements, the new Google polls that are available, the Jamboards. These are all things we're continuing to explore and look for recommendations. Fowler would love to get to a place where we can say, this one is money and we'd like to buy it for the whole staff. We're not quite there yet as we're still investigating. But it's those strategies, those thoughtful progresses, and making sure that the entire language arts 7 department, math 6, is aligned with what they're using, meeting on their Wednesdays to collaborate, what is working, what is not, are we on the same pace? And it's just given a great collaborative spirit as we move through the year. Couple quick highlights, I'm already taking too much time. 2 of the things that we're really excited about right now has stemmed from the conversations around individual needs in this unique environment. There's not a one-size-fits-all in distance learning that's going to work for everybody. We've realized that. So in conversation with some of our specialists in the building, special education ELD, it sounds like we're making a lot of really good on-the-fly accommodations for folks. But it's really complicated to get to a place where, hey, this is one strategy that works for everyone. Now that's our goal, to continue to look at kind of this universal instruction where we can leverage specific points, but the needs are so much different this year than what we felt before. So we've taken it upon ourselves to take a step forward at Fowler and go into some, from looking at our multi-tiered kind of tracking system of who's being successful, who isn't. We're targeting a lot of our students who are not finding success, as well as some that are finding high levels, and asking those targeted empathy questions of what is working and what isn't. So what can we replicate that's really going well for other students? And what are some of the bridges and barriers for others that we need to find a way to get across from one side to the other? So we're in the middle of our empathy interview process to learn more about the student and parent perspective. And one of the data points that we saw out of Q1 is that our Latinx community, we don't have enough of the answers. We didn't have a large enough sample of a participation in an earlier survey. And some of the nuances within our ELD and Latinx population, we just don't have those answers. So this week, we're in the process of a 3-step family outreach. So we're gonna have an evening family roundtable. We're gonna have another morning one later in the week. And then we're gonna come back on Saturday and host yet another. So we know that people's work schedules are different and we want to get every voice we possibly can. So this is our first round of really diving into some family engagement that we hope continues throughout the year. So those are a couple pieces. I know that all of our 3 buildings have a whole lot of drivers that we are taking a look at, primary drivers, secondary drivers that move into change initiatives. If you guys are looking at that doc, I know there will be time for you to ask some questions, but I feel like I've spoken for much more than my 3 to 4 minutes. So I should probably pass on to the next principal that's sharing this evening.
You're good. Thank you, Andy. Next up, we've got Principal Tim Groth from Hazel Brook Middle School.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to share tonight. I'm really thankful that we get to go last in terms of elementaries and high school and middle, because we get a chance to learn from the trials and tribulations of the fall, so to speak. And I feel like the document that you probably have in front of you that looks like a million different things is really true. There are a million different things we're working on, but I'm going to try to boil it down to the most relevant ones for right now, using the most recent information that we have about students. And it's going to hit on the same themes that Andy hit on. It just maybe in sense of a way of problem of practice, and then the actions we're taking to correct them. So I think as we look at the data from Q1, which is the most recent data point we have for how students did in distance learning, we recognize that we had a lot of students that earned a no grade in terms of their academic performance during the first quarter. I think if we look at Hazel Brook in itself, we're over 1,200 no grades, and we have about 935 students. So if you boil that down, that's like, 1.35, no grades per student. Or, I mean, that doesn't mean every student had, 1 or 2 no grades, because some had, 6 and others had 0. But I think what that tells us is, that's extraordinary amount of courses where students have not earned a grade because they're having a hard time accessing things online, or because they're simply not engaged in what's happening in distance learning. And so I think, if we boil it down, even demographically, our Latinx population has a lot more NGs than any other group, and is much more represented in that data of NGs, no grades, than any other group, which presents a huge problem. I think that's a pattern that we recognize we need to address in terms of an opportunity gap. But I think distance learning has magnified that to a certain extent. And so, our problem number one is that we are not engaging students in a really relevant, authentic, and meaningful way in distance learning. And I think we know students that know how to play school and show up. They show up, they do their work, they turn it in, they do fine. But for students that don't necessarily have an experience with school as being a place that's built for them, they are not showing up and doing all the things that we would need them to. And so, that has led us to have conversations as a staff about what do we need to do to engage kids in a real way that they can connect to. And part of that is shifting gears from the teacher doing the talking and the students doing the listening to finding tools like Pear Deck that Andy talked about, Nearpod, Google Meets breakout rooms, so that students are doing much more interaction and talking over the course of a lesson. We have a saying that we use all the time where the person doing the talking does all the learning. So I'm learning a lot right now, but we need the same for students, in that they need to be doing the talking and the interacting, because that's how they're going to learn the content. And we're just discovering ways to do that still online. And so that's something we'll continue to do. Our teachers are working in PDSA cycles and have picked a new strategy or a tool to use and have done some planning. They're implementing it here over this week and next. And then we're getting back together to talk about how that went, to make some modifications to either keep that tool or to find a new one, simply because we know kids need to be more active in their online experience. The second piece is we did empathy interviews with about 40 students and about 25 parents in the month of December, just to find out what the school experience was like. And if you also look at those empathy interviews and you compare to our fall climate survey that Andy talked about a little bit, what's really glaring is that's missing for our students is that authentic connection with each other. And if there's anything we know about middle school kids, they're social beings, and they do things for the socializing, not necessarily for the content and learning yet. Their brains aren't there to really recognize the payoff of all the content and the learning academically, but they recognize immediately the payoff of feeling like they belong and they're accepted and they have friends. And so one thing we've been trying to address is how do we really create opportunities for that social connection in a remote environment where we're trying to stay socially distant. And Andy referenced this a little bit, but we've really introduced circles to our staff and are using circles in our staff meetings. And we've asked our teachers to be rolling out circles in morning meeting to simply practice providing a forum and a space for students to share how they're doing and to be heard. And that way, hopefully we can get in the practice of sharing and listening, which ultimately leads to a safer, more belonging spaces. I think that we have heard through empathy interviews that there are various experiences with Circle itself. Not all students by any means are feeling safe or comfortable enough to really share their own personal perspective and experience quite yet. But we're building to that point, and hopefully we can get a community where the Circle is a vehicle to help us create those safe spaces to talk about really hard things. We did some prompting last week, excuse me, around the events in Washington, D.C., and a prompt again yesterday in relation to when you have disagreement, what's a productive way to resolve that? How does it make you feel? And, just today I've heard from parents that say, some of my students, some of my kids are grateful for the opportunity and others are still afraid to share what they really think because of pushback and things that happen via social media when students actually share how they're feeling and it's different from someone else. So we have a long ways to go, but we have a vehicle that we're really working with our staff to build that facilitation with. So, the good thing about that is in that fall survey, when we started implementing circles in September, is our Black and Pacific Islander students shared that the circle is meaningful for them, much more meaningful than any other group. And they rated it at above a 3 and a 4 on our scale of how meaningful the circle is. And so we know that's a conduit to reaching the students that we need to reach that we're not reaching in other ways. So we're going to continue to stick with that. So with that, I'll kind of pass it back to Amber, and I'm sure Andrew can take us a little further.
Thank you, Tim, for that transition. And yes, next up is Andrew Curl, principal at Twilighty Middle School.
Good evening, everybody. It's always hard to go last because there's a lot of similarities between what the three schools are doing. And I think the context I'll kind of give for Twilighty is that we're just at slightly different places in how things have been implemented. I think what's really exciting about our SIP is that if you look at these three areas of focus for our primary drivers, these are things that I think will continue into brick and mortar once we're past distance learning. And I think that with all the trouble that distance learning has added to our school environment, one of the real benefits, which you've heard many times, is just the ability to collaborate and to work across the three schools. I think that's why these similarities are showing up. I know that our three buildings have weekly meetings to talk about our PD plan, for example. That's something that never happened prior to this environment. And it's also given our teachers an opportunity to be more aligned and to support one another. So at Twilighty, we started circle work last year prior to brick and mortar, and a lot of that came out of the equity work we were doing, as well as reimagining middle school. So a lot of the things that are foundational to what we're doing now came out of processes where we were hearing from students and family and staff about what was and wasn't working for middle school students. And one of those things is really students reporting their connectedness to their peers and to adults. So this year, kind of as Andy and Tim discussed, we really doubled down on that. And so we're starting faculty meetings in circle with one another, where every teacher is taking turns practicing facilitating those meetings. And it's really starting to bear some real fruit for us as a staff. We're getting to know each other better. We're building a relationship. It's helping with our collaboration. And it's also created space for us to process difficult things when they occur, such as, what happened last week, for example. So that's something that we're continuing to do. We're also working really closely with our building equity coordinators this year to help with a lot of our PD planning and getting a lot of our different lenses into how we are developing our staff through our staff pillar. And then in terms of student engagement, I think that, again, like Tim mentioned, I'm really glad that we're doing this in January, because I think a lot of us have spent a lot of months learning what engagement looks like in this environment. And my staff, we're already using Pear Deck prior to the distance learning. A lot of our teachers were, so it was a natural fit for us. So we bought a building license for that. And it's really helped us with engagement and allowing students to not opt out even when they felt discomfort being on camera. So that's been really a powerful tool for us to use at our staff meetings, but also as I'm dropping into classrooms, seeing how that's being implemented across the board. And then another place where that Andy mentioned in terms of universal design, I think is a problem of practice that was identified through the year. So that's not, if we were to create a SIP in the summer, I'm not sure that would have been an area of focus. But as we're looking at our no grade data for our EL students and our special education students, it was really clear that they were having a harder time with distance learning environment, and that with our new platforms and the new way we were rolling things out, we really needed to have a discussion about how we can create some universal systems for kids to be able to access school. And that means that they're looking on their Canvas pages. Is it easy for them to navigate? How many clicks does it take to get into an assignment? Are there visual cues set up for students? So these are things that our kids were telling us, our learning specialists were telling us, and it showed up in the data. And so we've spent a lot of time in the staff really trying to address that and creating some systems that kids can navigate no matter what classroom they're in, and be able to turn in work and have a workflow, as well as identify scaffolds and support built in within the assignments and within the learning management system. So that's been a big push for us as well. I feel like I'm over talking too, so I'm going to probably stop there and open for questions, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Andrew. So we want to shift over to the board and open it up for a roundtable discussion for clarifying questions, probing questions, going as deep into the driver diagrams that you have seen as you would like. So I will turn it over to the board and allow for some great discussion.
I will just be quick and actually hold my questions and let my fellow board members and our students get after it. So thank you. Great presentations, and I really appreciate you three. So board members.
I'm hoping somebody has a really short a description of Pear Deck and what makes it different than Breakouts or Kahoot or whatever the other tools. Is that an easy thing to describe?
Yeah, I can try. So Pear Deck, it's a slideshow that's interactive essentially. And so students log into that with a code. And what you can do is you can put a prompt on a screen of a slide and kids can type responses in that the teacher can see or present those responses to the class. They can do drawing, polls, agree, disagree. So there's sort of ways for, if students are feeling or in a space where they maybe can't engage by turning their camera on or speaking, that they're still able to have their voices heard. And teachers can use that data to track their engagement.
So I have a question. I heard Andrew talk about how morning meetings started before the COVID lockdown. Is that correct? That you were doing that back when we were in brick and mortar? And,
yeah. Yes.
And I'm just wondering, were the other two middle schools doing that as well? Or were you doing the, Hawk Time, the old stuff that I remember? Or were you guys doing the circle time then as well?
I can speak for Fowler. We were in pilot mode. So we had about 6 staff members trained and we're trying it on in classrooms, but by no means was it systematized at Fowler.
Okay.
Hazel, Brook, with the same place as Fowler. We have worked in circles as a staff, but we've never taken that out to students. So this year was the first time we took the opportunity to ask teachers to facilitate circles in morning meetings with students.
And so then after we get back into the buildings, is it your intention to continue with circles at all of the schools?
Absolutely. I think I'll speak for Hazelbrook, but I think circles are the vehicle to helping students feel connected all the way down the road, forever and ever, as far as I'm concerned. It's basically a protocol that allows everyone to share and be listened to without the need to debate or compete for space and time. And I think we know that there are certain students that will speak all the time if they have the opportunity, and others that will sit back and say nothing. So the circle allows the opportunity to say something without feeling like someone's going to debate you immediately following, because it's a protocol that goes around with everyone in turn. And so it allows us to get into that space and share. But we're just getting started. I mean, our teachers are barely used to doing it yet. Some are still, teachers have never been trained as experts in how to help students share their feelings. They're more content experts at the middle school level. And so the journey's just beginning as far as I'm concerned, but definitely when we come back, they apply regardless of whether school is in person or distance learning.
And Jill, I would say that I feel like this has allowed us to redefine what participation can look like in our classrooms and definitely in our morning meeting structures. One anecdote, and this is on the staff side, we had 2 different staff-led circles. So we do this at the beginning of all of our staff meetings as well. And I had comments from 2 different groups on the same day that people came back kind of with this attitude, starting the circle, just frowny, frumpy, just don't really want to be here. But because we opened up with like a what is going well for you in your personal life kind of piece, wide open, by the time that this 8-minute session was done, every single person was laughing and giddy and couldn't wait to keep going. And it was just, sometimes you have to lead horses to water, right? And at that point in time, it was just, there was a whole lot of drinking going on.
I have a couple questions. One, first, thank you all for the presentation and for the opportunity. And this kind of might remind you of some of the questions that were asked at the previous levels, but I'm curious about the measurement / evaluation of the aims, and then how that could be recalibrated based on the data you're getting and what that sort of implementation on the ground side look like. So for example, the goal is 100% of students will speak during interactive and engaging set. I think someone mentioned that there's a tool being implemented that you're testing out, but can you walk us through a little bit? How do you know whether or not that's being met and to what degree it's being met? And then how do you recalibrate based on the data that you are getting back? I'm curious what the implementation looks like.
I'm happy to speak to that. I think that it's still trying to find systems to be able to track that. And, I know recently it comes down to being in classrooms and seeing which students are talking and being there. And I've downloaded on my iPad the class list of every class we offer in our school. And so when I go in, I have the class list there and I use a highlighter. And every time a student talks, I highlight it on my class list. At the end of my observation, I have those numbers and I put them in a sheet for myself that tracks the implementation data so I can see where we're at. But then also, it's rare that I'm there for an entire lesson for a teacher outside of a formal observation. But during those formal ones, I will literally track every single one. And then at the end, that will be a talking point for us in that debrief conversation to say, here's what I had in terms of who talked and who didn't. I'm also, as we're rolling this out, I'm also asking my teachers to keep track. So while during the lesson, I'm asking my teachers to actually have a class list there and to try to inventory who's talking and who's not so that they can monitor it themselves and don't have to rely on me, with the goal being that every single student should have their name called and have a chance to share in every lesson. So I think based on how that goes as we drop in, we'll see how we need to modify and look at it. But at this point, it's literally a spreadsheet that just has this teacher, here's how many students were talking. And I'm also keeping track of how many have their camera on, because I'm hoping more and more by talking, students will be more comfortable turning on their camera too as a byproduct. But we'll see. That's not the direct aim at this point, but this is byproduct. So that's just kind of how I'm working through it.
Yeah, and I would add on to Tim. I think we have a pretty similar process where I'm kind of going into classrooms, and a lot of this is happening through classroom observation. And granted, it looks very different than a normal classroom environment where I might be giving feedback by using a seating chart and marking on that when students have talked and kind of identifying some of those trends as we have debriefs with teachers. But I know like Pear Deck, you can become a co-teacher on that, so I can actually see the teacher side of what they're seeing as kids are participating. And that's another way to kind of collect that data around that piece. But in terms of measuring the safe and welcoming environment and impact circles on, we created a survey that was pretty similar across the 3 middle schools. And we relied on our MTSS district HOSA to help us with that. And so we are collecting real student voice on their perception data around how they're feeling. Whether they feel comfortable expressing their voice in classrooms, whether they feel connected to peers, and whether they feel like they have a trusted adult. And so we're obviously hoping as we give that measurement that will grow. And then for our family partnership, and Twilighty might be different in how we're measuring that, but we're really looking at our attendance data is kind of one of the major drivers as we're looking at our engagement efforts with families as another measuring tool.
One follow-up there, and just I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, but I am curious if or if you have a ballpark of 100% of students speaking in class. Where are we at right now? Are we starting at 10% of students on average across grade levels participating in the virtual environment, or do we just not have access to that data yet to be able to know?
I would say the baseline is pretty tricky, Ben, and part of that is because going into a classroom and watching kids speak, or the options that they were given prior to some of these tools coming out made it pretty challenging. Like a teacher might ask a question, and I might be able to track voices or kids on screens opening their mics to participate. But I think the chat function was really hard to track for me as an observer. Kids were putting stuff in there, and it was really hard for the teacher and for me to kind of identify how many kids have talked. So I think with like Jamboard or shared Google Docs or a Pear Deck, it's easier in a CDL environment to track that data than before. So in terms of baseline, we're hoping as that this gets implemented kind of across our system, we'll start to see some improvement. But I would say in most classes I'm in, it's close to 80-90% of kids are sharing throughout a lesson I'm seeing, but I don't think that was true at the beginning of the year.
Ben, when we first started crafting where we wanted to go with goals, and this was at all 3 schools, but for Fowler specifically, when we said we want to increase that engagement in the classroom, and I was doing informal tracking when I came in of who was participating, it was between the 10% number you threw out, no more than 50% of the students participating, right? Just because we're trying to dump our material in a 45-minute, 50-minute window to kids. But since we've been talking about this, just a simple conversation of, hey, use the expectation of dropping a word, a sentence in the chat. All of a sudden, students are either finding different venues. I'm going to share verbally. I'm going to write it in the chat. And I think Andrew's correct. That number's gone up incredibly since that conversation. I don't think Fowler quite yet is at 80-90%, but we're definitely moving in that direction.
And I would say I don't have baseline data for you, Ben, because I was actually shocked at how low the numbers were, like in terms of students that were talking during my 10 or 15-minute visits, because I think many of our teachers were trying to do this the way they would do in a classroom, where you talk and then you call on students and one student at a time shares. And I think what we recognize is that's not the secret to this environment. If you can go through an inventory and ask 30 questions and take 30 answers from 30 different students, but really the ultimate goal is that every student talks 25 times in a lesson, right? Or 30. And so I think that's why we're talking about Pear Deck and breakout rooms, because that provides opportunity to interact more often versus just the one time. But I think if we're trying to put it on a measurement scale, we're trying to just measure how often every student is having a chance to share and participate versus your traditional one question, one answer, because that's not engaging students the way that we want to.
Yeah. Another thing I would add is I think our work kind of around universal design shows up here as well. So I think a lot of the things our teachers are starting to embed is things like sentence stems and really written directions into their texts. And so I think that's also helping our students participate because they have an easier access point than they maybe would have had a couple months prior to us going through that as a staff.
Thank you for all of that. That's really fascinating and helpful. And I think that is a great illustration of, what we've heard from teachers in our email inboxes. We're finally starting to figure out CDL. And that, I think, is exactly a case study of what we're talking about. Not just, to Tim, your point, not just doing what we were doing when kids were in person and applying it to the online context, but really learning new skills. So kudos to you all for setting the vision as you have here. And big kudos to the teachers who are making massive adaptations to what they were taught in grad school and what they've learned to be seen. The numbers, Andrew and Andy, that you provided are really amazing and beyond what I was expecting. So great work to all 3 of you. And I've got other questions, but I think Maureen, you had some, and other board members might as well.
Sharon, you can go ahead if you'd like.
Yeah, thank you. So I was just wondering if, since you all are presenting after, the return back from the holidays, any new observations? How are kids doing? It's quite a week, last week to be starting back to school. Just wanted to know if we've been talking a lot, but I'm assuming most of this applies to before break. I didn't know if there's any differences this year, this time around. Are people excited to be back, or I just wanted to hear kind of general observations. If what you've already said doesn't really apply to this last week.
I mean, Sharon, I can say that in just popping through a dozen classrooms last week and this week, those tools are out and being used, and they weren't being used before the break. So like the Pear Deck, Nearpod is another thing that's very similar to Pear Deck. It's an interactive, slide deck mechanism. I was in a class today that blew me away. It was a band class, and kids were asked to manipulate this tool to verify different rhythms. And then there was a question on a collaboration board that simply said, what did you notice about manipulating these variables and these rhythms? And students typed on a message board anonymously without their name. And immediately they were posting messages and they were liking each other's posts. And it was, before that happened, it was dead silent. The teacher would ask a question and no one would say anything. And as soon as that message board was up, like everyone was sharing, and there were 7 likes to a simple sentence. And the teacher and I talked this afternoon about how that's the kid's environment. And it's like that social media lens to the classroom that all of a sudden it's motivating for kids to want to post and say something. And, I had never seen that in action like I saw today. So I think just using those tools that we hadn't known about before, it's encouraging to me to see kids get excited about talking about how to manipulate a rhythm tool and what that does, let alone to really get into something that's a lot more deeper and thoughtful than a simple surface level question. So that's what I would just share anecdotally from today.
So, and to piggyback off Tim's comment with these new tools that we're exploring and using, not only is it really valuable to be sharing them with teachers in a PD sense, hey, this is how this works, here's a testimony, but we're also modeling this for our staff. So in our staff meetings, we're doing our circle structure, we're also engaging our staff in the Pear Deck. So they're participating just like the students would and getting kind of excited about that. So I think it's the modeling of the tools that allows it to be then repeated and used in the classroom. One funny note that I'll add, at the beginning of the year, I think everyone in this room understood that there was a lot of sensitivity around the amount of work middle school students were being exposed to, that it wasn't enough. In our surveys that have come out and in all of our conversations as we're doing empathy interviews, now we're getting way too much. So I don't know if we've overcorrected. Clearly there's outliers on both sides of too much, too little. And I think we're just trying to figure out how to settle in to get the right rigor and the right volume that students can keep up with in a meaningful way that's going to extend their learning without overwhelming them with the back and forth of online submissions in this Canvas environment.
Thank you. I'd love to just hop in and if that's possible to just observe some of these new tools. They sound really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's interesting, Andrew, I saw a post from one of your staff members thinking about circle time, because I was fortunate. I mean, it was literally just a few days before COVID shut us down. I visited Twilighty because it's one of my schools. And I sat in circle time with Andrew in one of the classes. And the staff member commented on with the redo of the schedule, particularly at Twilighty, that reduced morning time, that had been more embedded, I think, and working at the school. And now I think it's interesting that it's too much. I will say I was an advocate for the redesign of the middle school. I think some of the opportunities on core content was valuable. So I just appreciate you all moving forward, continuing to get that feedback and figure out where the right balance is for our students. And you're right, there's always opinions on the whole spectrum of what's working, but I know you guys have done a ton of work to try to keep meeting the needs of your students. One of my questions, so Thursday night, we have the Washington County Legislative Summit, and Brian Bain collected Washington County data, put it together so we present as a county cohort, if you will, to our legislators. And, part of that presentation will be number of Fs or incompletes, grade not completed, to talk about just some of the challenges. So to you all, it sounds like you're really doing some fantastic strategies and how we're engaging and how we're moving forward. But I don't, and I apologize, you guys, if you had it and I'm not pulling it up in my mind. So as we move our students forward, how are we grabbing what wasn't completed in the past to try to move that forward as well? Hopefully that makes sense on some of those grades. Because also in sharing those stories with our legislators, middle school looks particularly high, but it's also what's always funny about numbers, right? Because at the high school, there's 4 classes versus middle school, so there's greater opportunities. So the numbers are higher just because there's more opportunities because of the number of courses. But anyway, if you just kind of how are we continuing to build to grow, and then also trying to help move forward on some of those non-completed, and open to anyone wanting to answer that.
I'll try. So Maureen, I think there's 2 things that are at the heart of that. I think number one is that the assignment completion and how things are coming in is an indicator of how students are accessing and how relevant the learning is for them. And I think as I said a little earlier, I think we're working uphill in the fact that there's no social connection around a lot of the work. And, when students are asked to sit at home and do this assignment during asynchronous time away from their teachers, that's just not very motivating unless you really see meaning in the content. And I think that, moving forward, we need to work as a staff of how to make those activities really relevant and meaningful for kids so that they can see the benefit of them versus just doing them because this is what your teacher assigned you to do. And those of us that do the work for compliance sake because we have to are pretty successful. Those that don't see the meaning in it, or it's just not part of like an instilled value system quite yet. If you do this because this is you're supposed to, are the ones that are struggling. And so it's all about finding meaning and relevance. That's one thing for me. The second one for me is that I think that it's looking at the heart of the way we actually give grades to students. And I think there's grading philosophy runs the gamut in terms of what you believe a grade is supposed to reflect, and then how you collect information to give that grade. And I think that a lot of those NG grades are a result of, as Andy said, an overwhelming amount of work that needs to be completed and turned in to earn the grade, versus maybe shifting our system to focus on what are the most important pieces that demonstrate students learning towards standards that then impact a grade, versus turning in assignment after assignment after assignment after assignment. And I think that, down the road for me, CDL probably isn't the best time to introduce the topic of grading practices to my staff, right? As we're doing that. But I think that,
why not? Yeah.
because it's so difficult to talk about. But I think down the road, that's next on the list once we get beyond, really cement circles and connection and engagement, is then what do you want a grade to represent? And are our grades really representing students learning towards standards, or are they representing whether or not they're turning their work in? And I think that, that will help to shape what those NGs look like, because a lot more students are growing than I think is indicated in that data. I think that data is really more a byproduct of students' ability to check off the boxes. And I think that's just something that comes from just evolving our practices and our systems to meet the needs of our students and to give authentic feedback. So I think that's how I would speak to that really candidly. I don't know, Andy and Andrew, you might have something else to say about that.
I think the only thing, I think you said it really well, Tim. Tim's absolutely right that relevance is going to be a key for kids engaging with content. And it's harder to determine what that looks like in this environment for sure. And then the other component that I think we identified is that kids were just having trouble with the tools. In first quarter, I don't want to make excuses, but it did take a lot of time. One of the things we asked our teachers to do is sit down with a student and from an iPad lens, which looks different than a computer lens, go through and try to figure out how to turn something in Canvas and access something if you were to miss a class. And one of the kids that I worked with, there was about 7 different clicks. You had to download a document and turn it back in. And then we're thinking about middle school and executive functioning, and it was really challenging. So I think that's creating some common understanding with our staff around what it actually looks like for a kid when they're home by themselves to use this tool they've never used before, figure out how to click into it, how to turn it in, and have just the executive functioning to make that happen for themselves, and create a schedule. Is definitely challenging at any level, and especially challenging in middle school. So I think that part of that, again, not to make excuses, definitely showed up in our NG data. And to Tim's point, one of the things our teachers really did do, even if they gave NGs, is we added, I think, a tremendous amount of comments to how we reported feedback from quarter one. And part of the intent was to really give actionable written feedback, as opposed to just giving a letter grade for what might have been just work completion, et cetera, prior to this. So hopefully those NGs will improve in Q2.
The additional comments that I would make on this, one, in this, I'm very humbled by this, but it probably took us 6 to 8 weeks to realize what teachers were interfacing on their computers was different than what students were interfacing on their iPads. So we were given very clear instructions. If you're on a PC, but our kids didn't have those. And so it took quite a while. And as we know that when you get buried and behind, catching up, especially in an environment like this where I can't even go walk to find my teacher, it's incredibly difficult. So we definitely had tech issues, but on the proactive piece, what are our buildings doing? The multi-tiered systems that we're setting up to track student engagement, to track grades, to track attendance. We've got some robust teams coming together. I think in a stronger fashion than ever before. We have folks, I mean, in this recent shutdown, we've kind of put pause on this to some extent, but we are doing a lot of home visits, knocking on doors. I've done multiple. It's been fun. It's been rewarding to try to advocate and communicate with students. And this is a big conversation point that we're having right now with parents who are calling and saying, my kid won't get out of bed to get online. Well, yes, we need to create more relevance, but we also need to be thinking about, if you as a parent can't get them here, how can we look at the limited in person to help with that piece, to bring students in, to create that engagement, to get them started, and then send them back home after their motor's running. So those are some of the conversations that we're in right now proactively about how can we assist in getting more connection, more success, and ultimately more learning.
You guys, thank you very much. Really appreciate that conversation, because I'm sure that it's valuable for me to know, period, but I think it's also an important conversation we'll have on Thursday as well. So thank you. It is 6 o'clock. I am assuming that was the time that we were to wrap up. Rowan, Emily, any questions though before we, you guys are both good? Okay. Board members, all good? Okay. Amber, thank you. Principals, thank you so much. Just really appreciate, I'm getting in the groove of the flow charts. So I really appreciate the one-pager model and really identifying all those pieces. So thank you all. Have a great rest of your evening if you weren't joining us at 6:30. And the rest of you, I will see you back in a short bit. So for now, we are adjourned, and I'll see you all at 6:30. Good night.
Thanks, board members. Thanks, students.
So Lisa,